On my 73rd birthday, my husband placed another woman and 2 children next to me and said to the guests, "This is my second family, the one I've kept hidden for 30 years. My daughters looked on in horror, but I just smiled, handed him the box, and said, "I knew this was for you." He opened it, and his hands began to shake. "Before we begin, I would be very happy if you would subscribe to our channel, like it, and write in the comments what country you are listening to me from. I am always interested in knowing where my listeners live. Enjoy listening." The room, until that moment filled with the hum of conversation and the tinkling of glasses, collapsed into silence so thick it seemed to smother the air. Every face, every breath, every gesture froze in mid-motion. My daughters, Jennifer and Teresa, sat at either end of the table. Jennifer's eyes went wide, her lips parting as though words had been stolen from her tongue. Teresa's hand, still resting on her wine glass, trembled, making the crystal ring a faint, mournful note. They looked at me, desperate for explanation, for reassurance, for something, anything, that might soften the blow their father had just delivered. But there was nothing soft in his voice. Gerald spoke the way one announces a triumph, chest puffed, eyes shining, a man convinced that what he revealed was not betrayal but revelation. "This is my second family, the one I've kept hidden for 30 years. He said it with the pride of a man revealing an invention, not the shame of one confessing a sin. His hand settled on the shoulder of the woman standing beside him, a woman dressed too carefully for the occasion, her smile brittle, her eyes sweeping the room as if she were taking inventory of her victory. And then there were the children, or rather, not children at all. Young adults, perhaps in their late 20s, each carrying fragments of Gerald's face, as though nature had conspired to etch his betrayal into flesh. The boy had his square jaw, the girl his dark eyes. They stood stiff, uncertain whether they were being introduced or exhibited. Whispers erupted like sparks catching dry wood. My friends, seated close enough to feel the heat of my humiliation, leaned back in their chairs, their eyes darting between me and Gerald, between the life they thought they knew, and the secret that had just been dragged into the light. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. Another shook her head so violently, I thought her earrings might fly off. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. I, however, remained perfectly still. My hands rested lightly on my lap, my face composed, my breath steady. A smile curled across my lips, not of joy, but of something sharper, something forged in quiet suffering and patient resolve. Because I had known. Long before Gerald paraded his shame into my home, I had pieced together the puzzle he thought I was too blind to see. The late nights, the evasive explanations, the secretive accounts that didn't balance. For years, I let him believe I was a fool, but a fool I was not. Jennifer let out a strangled gasp, and Teresa whispered, "Mom," her voice trembling with the weight of both disbelief and despair. I turned my head slightly toward them, just enough for them to see the calm in my eyes. It steadied them, though it did not erase their pain. Gerald mistook my composure for weakness. He thought silence meant surrender. He thought that by dropping this burden onto my shoulders in front of an audience, he had ensured my humiliation would be total and irreversible. That I would crumble, that I would plead, that I would beg for scraps of dignity from the man who had already stolen so much of my life. But instead, I reached beneath the table, where the box I had prepared rested on the floor by my chair. I placed it in his hands, my voice steady, almost sweet. "I knew this was for you." The color in his face shifted instantly, from flushed pride to a pallor that betrayed unease. His fingers fumbled with the wrapping paper, tearing it awkwardly, his movements betraying a sudden tremor. The guests leaned forward, curiosity now mingled with dread. My daughter's eyes, wet with unshed tears, followed every motion as though their futures depended on what that box might hold. And then, as the lid came free and his eyes scanned the contents, his hands began to shake more violently. The bravado drained from him, drop by drop, until the man who had strutted into the room only moments before stood stripped of his certainty. He looked not at me, not at his so-called second family, but at the box itself, as though the truth it carried might leap out and devour him whole. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on every chest, squeezing every throat. It was no longer the stunned silence of shock, but the suffocating silence of revelation, the silence that falls when the world as you knew it has been turned inside out. And in that silence I sat perfectly still, my smile unbroken, my dignity intact. Because in that moment, before a single word more was spoken, I was no longer the victim of Gerald's betrayal. I was the architect of his reckoning. Gerald, my husband of 5 decades, stood proudly as though this cruel revelation was some sort of gift. His mistress, Linda, held her chin high, while her grown children, who bore Gerald's features, shifted uncomfortably. Gasps and whispers filled the room. My daughters, Jennifer and Teresa, clutched their glasses, their eyes burning with betrayal. My heart cracked, but I refused to let him see me break. For a moment, I studied the scene as if it were a play staged for my destruction. Gerald stood in the center like an actor basking in applause, his hand lightly resting on Linda's arm, as though presenting her with the same flourish one might use to unveil a statue. He didn't bow his head, didn't stumble over his words, didn't show even the faintest shadow of shame. Instead, his shoulders squared, his voice rang out clear, and his smile, God help me, was radiant. It was the smile of a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. And Linda, oh Linda, she was no young temptress, no fleeting fling plucked from the margins of his life. She was polished, prepared, wrapped in elegance as though she had spent years rehearsing for this moment. Her lipstick matched the deep red of her dress, her pearls gleamed under the chandelier's glow, and her eyes flicked over me with the quiet triumph of a victor surveying the battlefield. She had not only taken my husband, she had taken my time, my years, my sacrifices, and now she sought to take my dignity too. The children, or should I call them intruders, stood stiffly at her side. Not children at all, but adults whose lives had unfolded in the shadows of my own marriage. The boy had Gerald's jawline, square and stubborn, while the girl had his dark, piercing eyes. Every feature screamed of their parentage, every tilt of the head, every nervous glance a reminder of the lies that had stretched across 3 decades. They avoided looking directly at me, their eyes darting to the floor, to the guests, to the table laid with birthday cake and candles that now seemed grotesque in their cheerfulness. They shifted their weight from one foot to the other, as though even they were ashamed of the stage their father had built. Around us, the guests became a jury without a verdict. Some leaned in, their eyes wide with morbid fascination, while others recoiled as though caught in the blast of something unholy. The whispers slid across the table like serpents. 30 years? Hidden. His second family? On her birthday? Every breath carried judgment, pity, disbelief. Some guests avoided my eyes entirely, unable to bear the rawness of my humiliation. Others watched me with open curiosity, hungry to see whether I would cry, shout, collapse. My daughters, though, bore the weight more heavily than anyone. Jennifer's glass shook so violently in her hand that red wine sloshed against the rim, spilling onto the white tablecloth like a wound opening before my eyes. Her face, usually so composed, was twisted in disbelief. Teresa's eyes were already wet, brimming with tears that refused to fall, as though she still clung to the hope that this might be some cruel joke, some tasteless performance rather than the reality that it was. Their grief cut deeper than my own, for they had not only lost the father they thought they knew, they had gained the shame of knowing they were the byproduct of his deceit. Inside me, something cracked. A splintering of trust, of memory, of the fragile structure I had built over half a century. My mind raced back through the decades. The nights Gerald claimed to be working late, the weekends he disappeared under the guise of business, the sudden expenses that never quite added up. All those years I had pushed away suspicion, convincing myself that doubt was poison, that a good wife trusted her husband. And now, every dismissed question, every silenced instinct, every brushed-off worry came rushing back, screaming their truth. But I refused to give him what he wanted. He wanted my collapse, my public unraveling, the confirmation that his betrayal had destroyed me. He wanted the sympathy of the room to tilt toward him and his other family, painting me as the bitter relic of a marriage he had long abandoned. No, I would not play that part. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and folded my hands neatly on my lap. My heart thudded against my ribs with the violence of a trapped bird, but my face remained serene. A smile curved across my lips, not of joy, not of forgiveness, but of defiance. I let him see that smile, let Linda catch the glint of steel behind it, let every guest in that room know that I would not shatter. For what is betrayal if not a test of the soul? And mine, though cracked and bleeding, refused to break. So I sat there, silent but unyielding, watching as Gerald basked in his cruelty. Linda drank in the spectacle, and their children shifted uneasily under the weight of stolen years. My daughters clung to their glasses, their knuckles white, their eyes begging me for a reaction. And still, I gave them none. Because the stage had been set, the roles assigned, and the script written by his hand. But I had my own ending to deliver, and it would not be tonight. As I looked at Linda's smug face and the two young adults who shared Gerald's features, hatred surged through me. Not at them, but at the man I once called my partner. For decades, I washed his shirts, cooked his meals, and carried his burdens. Now I realized that every late night at work had been another lie. My love for him turned to ashes in an instant. Hatred is not born in a single breath. It is distilled over years, drop by drop, until it gathers enough weight to crush the heart. And in that moment, it crashed down on me all at once. I thought of the countless mornings I rose before dawn to iron his shirts so he would step into the world looking sharp and respected. I thought of the pots of stew I left simmering so that he would never come home to an empty table. I thought of the nights I rubbed his temples when he claimed exhaustion, whispering comfort while he drifted off. Only now I knew it wasn't work that had drained him, but the double life he was feeding like a parasite. Every kindness I had ever shown him curdled into fuel for my hatred. Each small sacrifice, each moment of loyalty, each quiet prayer I had whispered for his success now seemed like ammunition he had used against me, strengthening the facade he hid behind. I had carried his burdens as though they were my own, not realizing he was manufacturing them, piling them onto me while he lived freely elsewhere. Linda's face was a mask of victory. She thought she had won something. Won him, won status, won a seat at my table. But I did not hate her. No, my hatred was reserved solely for Gerald, because she could only ever take what he willingly offered. He was the architect of this humiliation, the builder of this second life, the man who had stood beside me for 50 years, while chiseling away at the very foundation of our marriage. The children, his other children, stood uncomfortably in their own skins. Their resemblance to him was a cruel reminder that every lie he told me had been etched into their faces. Yet even as I looked at them, I felt no hatred. How could I? They had not asked to be born into deceit. They were simply living proof of his betrayal, shadows of choices made in secrecy. My wrath could not reach them, for they were as much victims as my daughters. The hatred, burning and sharp, remained fixed on him alone. I remembered the years we pinched pennies, the nights I sat at the kitchen table balancing bills, while Gerald swore we had no money for luxuries. And yet, somewhere across town, another home had been furnished, another table set, another family fed with the same resources I had fought to stretch. He had let me wear shoes with worn soles, let me mend dresses instead of buying new ones, while Linda surely flaunted pearls he paid for with the sweat of my hands. It was not just the betrayal of love, but the theft of life itself. 30 years. 30 years in which I grew older, thinking I was walking beside one man, while in truth, he was walking 2 paths at once. 30 years in which my body aged, my skin wrinkled, my hands grew rough with work, while his other life thrived in secrecy, untouched by the sacrifices I thought we made together. My love for him did not die quietly. It combusted. It turned to ash and smoke, leaving behind nothing but the acrid taste of bitterness. To love a man for 5 decades, to give him your youth, your strength, your loyalty, and then to discover that your love was nothing more than camouflage for his deceit, this is not a sorrow one recovers from. It is a wound that cauterizes into hatred. I sat there, my lips curved into the faintest smile, but inside me a storm raged. The smile was not kindness. It was armor. It was the face of a woman who would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. He might have stolen my trust, but he would not steal my dignity. My hatred was my strength now. It stiffened my spine, steadied my breath, kept my tears locked firmly inside where he could not see them. I studied him carefully, the way one studies a stranger who has wandered into familiar territory. The man I once adored was gone. In his place stood a liar cloaked in the skin of my husband. Every memory of tenderness, his hand brushing mine at the dinner table, his laughter on long drives, his vows whispered in our youth, now reeked of falsehood. He had rewritten our history with every secret rendezvous, every whispered promise to another woman. Hatred sharpened my vision. It allowed me to see him clearly for the first time in years, not as a husband, not as a partner, not even as a father, but as a coward. A man so small he could only inflate himself by building a second life in shadows. A man so weak he could not live honestly in the home he had chosen, but instead sought validation in the arms of another. And as I sat there, my daughter's grief spilling across their faces, Linda's smugness growing with each passing second, and Gerald's pride radiating like a torch, I felt the hatred coil around my heart like iron. It was heavy, yes, but it was also steady. It kept me from trembling, from falling apart. Hatred, in that moment, became the scaffolding that held me upright. My love had turned to ashes, and from those ashes, something harder was born. Gerald raised his glass and began to toast. To family, both old and new. His audacity made my blood boil. He had humiliated me on the very day meant to honor my life. Anger spread through the room. Jennifer shouted, "Dad, how could you?" Guests whispered in disbelief. Yet I did not scream. I did not weep. I simply smiled and said, "Gerald, I have something for you too." The words had barely left his lips before the room fractured. The clink of silverware against porcelain fell silent, laughter evaporated, and every gaze fixed on him as though he had grown horns. But Gerald, blind with arrogance, reveled in it. His glass glimmered under the chandelier's light, held high like a trophy. His voice carried across the room with a false warmth, as though betrayal could be dressed in the language of unity. "To family," he repeated, pausing just long enough to let the cruelty sink in, both old and new. The audacity of it struck me harder than the initial revelation. To declare his shame as pride, to use my birthday as his stage, to believe he could stitch together his lies with a toast. It was unbearable. My chest tightened, fury rising with every heartbeat. The veins in my temples throbbed, and yet, outwardly, I remained still. Jennifer's voice shattered the tension like glass against stone. "Ted, how could you?" Her words were not a question, but a scream of betrayal torn from her soul. Her hands shook as she pushed back her chair, the screech of wood on polished floor echoing like thunder. Teresa, though silent, pressed both hands to her mouth, as if afraid that if she opened it, she would vomit from disgust. Around us, the guests whispered like a restless wind. Unbelievable. On her birthday? After 50 years? The words drifted across the table, soft yet piercing, each one feeding the fire roaring inside me. My humiliation had become a spectacle, my pain a performance for all to consume. But Gerald, he smiled. Smiled as though nothing had shattered, as though he hadn't detonated a bomb in the center of our lives. His eyes shone with that same self-satisfaction I had come to know too well. He believed he had seized control of the narrative, that by raising his glass he could sanctify his betrayal, reframe it as some grand gesture of honesty. He thought a toast could make theft sound like generosity, deceit sound like courage. My blood burned. Anger coursed through me not as a fleeting surge, but as a steady flood, hot and relentless. My mind replayed every year, every sacrifice, every moment I had chosen silence for the sake of peace, and I realized that silence had fed him. My patience had been his alibi. My loyalty had been his shield. And now, in front of my daughters, my friends, my community, he dared to turn my silence into his stage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to let the rage that consumed me burst from my lungs and scorch him where he stood. I wanted to knock the glass from his hand, watch it shatter, watch the wine bleed across the floor as a mirror of my own spilled years. But anger is not always fire. Sometimes it is ice, sharp, cutting, precise. And I knew in that moment that my strength was not in shouting, but in holding. The guests leaned forward, waiting for my collapse. Some pitied me, some anticipated drama, some simply thirsted for the spectacle of an old woman's breakdown. But I would not give them that. I would not give Gerald the satisfaction of seeing me reduced to tears, a broken relic of his discarded life. Instead, I smiled. A thin, controlled smile that concealed the storm raging inside me. My hands did not tremble. My voice did not waver. I looked him directly in the eye, and with a calmness that chilled even me, I said to Gerald, "I have something for you, too." The words hung in the air, quiet yet heavy, a thread of steel cutting through the noise. The room stilled again. Guests held their breath. Gerald's smirk faltered for the first time, the corners of his mouth twitching as though some instinct warned him that beneath my calm was not surrender, but judgment. Inside me, anger rose higher, but it no longer consumed me. It shaped me. It carved me into stone. Every whisper of humiliation, every ounce of betrayal, every sacrifice I had made was now weaponized. I was no longer the wife he had deceived, the woman he thought too fragile to withstand the truth. I was his reckoning, and though he did not yet know it, he would soon learn what it meant to betray a woman who had given everything. My daughters stared at me, confusion flickering across their grief. They had expected me to crumble, to cry, to rage. Instead, they saw something else, something sharper, something harder. They saw anger held like a blade, gleaming just beneath the surface. And as I sat there, my smile fixed, my eyes locked on the man who had torn my life apart, I felt the fire inside me turn cold and steady. Not a flame that flickered, but an ember that would not die until it had burned through every last remnant of his arrogance. Gerald raised his glass, as if nothing were wrong, and declared, to family, both old and new. Jennifer screamed, "Dad, how dare you?" Teresa buried her face in her hands. Friends whispered in disgust. Still, Gerald stood tall, thinking he had won some twisted victory. That was the moment I decided to stand, not as his victim, but as his judge. The toast struck like a blade twisted deeper into an already open wound. His words rang false, their hollow cheer echoing through the room like a curse. It wasn't a toast to family. It was a toast to betrayal, to deception, to the long years he had stolen from me and from the daughters who now sat shattered at my table. He held the glass high, a symbol of conquest, as though he had brought peace instead of war, harmony instead of ruin. The guests' faces reflected the truth. No one believed in the farce he tried to stage. Their eyes shifted uneasily between me and him, their whispers slithering across the tablecloth like smoke. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, eager to catch every word of the unfolding scandal. My humiliation had become theater, my pain a spectacle, but Gerald basked in it like an emperor parading spoils before a crowd. Jennifer's voice broke the false cheer, slicing through the room with the raw pain only a daughter can feel. "Dad, how dare you?" Her cry was more than anger. It was the cracking of trust, the shattering of years spent looking up to him as a father. Her face, flushed and trembling, held not just rage but grief, the grief of losing a father in one breath. Teresa could not even look. Her small hands covered her face, shielding her eyes from the scene, as if she could block out the sight of the man she once adored. Silent sobs shook her shoulders, and my heart ached to see her collapse under the weight of his cruelty. Both my daughters sat there, robbed not only of a father, but of the illusion that he had ever been the man they believed him to be. And yet Gerald stood tall. His back straightened, his chest swelled, and his glass gleamed in the light. He thought himself triumphant, as though the unveiling of his second family were not an act of treachery, but of courage. He mistook the gasps of horror for awe, the whispers of disgust for admiration. His smirk widened, blind to the truth that every eye in the room judged him already. It was in that instant that something shifted inside me. I felt the rage burn, yes, but I also felt it cool into clarity. My humiliation would not be the final act. No, I would not allow this day to be carved into memory as the day I was destroyed. If he believed he had written the ending to my story, he had gravely underestimated me. I sat straighter in my chair, the weight of 73 years lifting from my shoulders. I realized I did not have to wait for someone else to speak justice over this moment. I was justice. I had lived through the lean years when he brought home little and still demanded much. I had endured his absences, his excuses, his moods. I had borne the weight of loyalty while he lived freely in deceit. If anyone had the right to render judgment, it was me. The murmurs of the crowd fed me, their disgust strengthening my resolve. I could feel their eyes searching my face, waiting for me to collapse into tears or fury. But I would not give them that satisfaction. Not Gerald, not Linda, not the strangers who sat in stunned silence. Instead, I gave them stillness, a stillness so deliberate it commanded attention. I thought of my daughters, their lives entwined with mine, their futures shaped by the man who had now betrayed us all. I thought of the guests who would carry this story into the world, who would speak of my strength or my ruin. And I thought of myself, not as the wife abandoned, not as the woman humiliated, but as the judge who held the gavel in her hand. A strange calm settled over me, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from resolve. My anger no longer threatened to spill uncontrollably. It hardened, focused, turned to steel. I looked at Gerald and saw not a husband, not even a man, but a defendant standing in the court of truth. And I was ready to pass sentence. That was the moment I stood, not physically yet, but within myself. I stood against the weight of betrayal. I stood against the humiliation he thought he had bound me in. I stood in defiance of his arrogance. He believed this was his victory, but in truth it was his trial, and I would be his judge. I leaned forward and slid the neatly wrapped box toward him. "Gerald," I said softly, "I have something for you too." His arrogance faltered as he tore at the ribbon. Inside wasn't a watch or tie. It was a collection of documents, divorce papers, property transfers, bank statements exposing his secret accounts. Each page was already signed, stamped, and filed with the court. The moment my hands released the box, a hush descended. The scrape of forks against plates, the low hum of whispers, the muffled sobs from Teresa, all of it died. Every guest leaned forward unconsciously, their eyes fixed on the package now resting before Gerald like a sacred relic. For a man who believed he had choreographed this evening, the sight of my gift unsettled him. His smirk twitched, almost imperceptibly, as though some deep instinct warned him that this was no trinket, no sentimental offering. He tried to maintain his composure. His fingers plucked at the ribbon with exaggerated ease, pulling it loose as though nothing could rattle him. But I noticed the stiffness in his knuckles, the way his nails dug into the velvet cord. The box, wrapped in plain paper without a bow, sat heavy on the table. He tugged the cover free, and for a breath, the air itself seemed to tighten, waiting. Linda shifted beside him, curiosity pricking through her painted mask of confidence. She tilted her head slightly, her pearl earring catching the light, her lips curving in anticipation. To her, this was theater. She expected some trite symbol, perhaps a family heirloom offered in bitterness, something she could laugh at later. Her children craned their necks too, eager to see what token I had brought into this spectacle. But as Gerald peeled back the paper and lifted the lid, the truth revealed itself. Not jewelry, not cufflinks, not the sentimental clutter of a long marriage. Documents. Stacks of them, bound neatly, stamped and signed with authority that could not be denied. His hand froze mid-motion, hovering above the first page. For a heartbeat, he didn't breathe. Then, as his eyes scanned the familiar lettering, the blood drained from his face. The arrogance he had worn like armor began to crack. He turned a page, then another. His lips parted, but no words came. The silence in the room deepened, shifting from curiosity to awe. Guests glanced at one another, their expressions mirroring a single thought. What has she done? Jennifer leaned forward, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide not with grief now, but with astonishment. Teresa lowered her hands from her face, blinking through her haze of sorrow, her gaze fixed on me as if seeing me anew. Inside that box lay the record of his undoing. Divorce papers with my signature firm and resolute. Property transfers that placed the house, the cars, and the accounts in my name alone. Bank statements that exposed the hidden funds he thought were invisible, pulled from shadows and pinned to the page. Each document was a blade, and together they formed an executioner's sword. The weight of it pressed down on him. He fumbled, his once proud hands trembling as they turned page after page. Each line of ink was a nail in the coffin of his pretense. He had believed me blind, passive, compliant. He had mistaken my silence for ignorance, my patience for weakness. And now, in front of everyone he had chosen as witnesses to my humiliation, the truth poured down on him instead. I said nothing more. My silence was deliberate, the silence of a judge allowing the evidence to speak. The documents were eloquent enough. They told the story of a man who had squandered his vows, who had tried to divide his life between two homes, who had stolen trust and money alike. They revealed not just his betrayal, but his failure to cover it, his arrogance in believing no one would ever uncover his second existence. Linda leaned closer, her smirk slipping. Her manicured hand touched the edge of the box, as if needing proof that what she saw was real. Her eyes darted across the words, and for the first time that evening, her confidence wavered. She had expected to share in triumph. Instead, she was now tethered to his exposure. The guests sat rigid, barely daring to breathe. Some eyes flicked toward me, then back to Gerald, then down at the papers as though they, too, could feel the force of the ink. What had begun as my humiliation had transformed into his reckoning, staged on the very ground he had chosen. Gerald's breathing quickened. The glass he had raised only moments before now sat abandoned, its wine untouched. His fingers clutched the edges of the papers so tightly the sheets crinkled under his grip. He swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat did not move. And I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, my expression calm, my smile small but unyielding. For once, I did not need to raise my voice. The documents were my voice. The signatures were my defiance. The stamps were my judgment. The box had been unwrapped, the truth laid bare, and Gerald, once the proud actor of this cruel play, now stood exposed as the defendant. The color drained from Gerald's face. Linda grabbed his arm, her smirk vanishing as she saw the papers. My guests gasped, some even clapped. I stood tall and said, "This is your true gift, Gerald. You can keep your second family. I'm keeping everything else, our home, our assets, and most importantly, my dignity. Today isn't the day you humiliated me. It's the day you freed me." The words struck the air like a gavel cracking against hardwood. For a moment, the entire room held its breath, as though waiting for Gerald to speak, to defend, to deny. But nothing came. His mouth opened, then closed again, a man drowning without words, flailing in silence. The hands that once held authority over boardrooms and family dinners now shook helplessly over the incriminating papers spread before him. Linda's grip on his arm was tight, but not out of love, out of fear. Her perfectly painted lips tightened into a line, her eyes darting across the room, seeking escape routes in the gaze of strangers. The smirk that had carried her into this house, the smug confidence of a woman who believed she had won, dissolved into panic. For the first time, she looked small, like a thief caught in daylight. Around us, the guests became witnesses to a trial they had not expected to attend. They shifted in their chairs, some leaning forward with morbid fascination, others sitting back as if the force of truth was too much to bear. Whispers hissed through the air. Divorce papers. She knew all along. He's finished. Their murmurs grew into a chorus of judgment, a verdict rendered not in a courtroom, but in my dining room. Jennifer's hand slammed the table, tears streaking down her cheeks, but now they were not only tears of grief, they were tears of vindication. She looked at me with awe, as though she had just discovered a strength in me she had never fully understood. Teresa, her face pale and streaked with salt, finally lowered her trembling hands from her eyes. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising with something that looked dangerously close to relief. I stood taller than I had in years. The weight of decades, of lies endured, of sacrifices unthanked, of dignity silently guarded, lifted from me in that instant. My voice did not tremble. It rang with authority, steady and precise. I was no longer a wife. I was no longer a victim. I was a judge passing sentence, a jury delivering truth, an executioner wielding justice. "This is your true gift, Gerald," I repeated, my words slow, deliberate, each syllable carved into his pride. You wanted spectacle? Then let it be so. But it will not be my downfall on display tonight. It is yours. You can keep your second family, the one you paraded before me, as if I were too weak to endure the truth. Keep them. But know this, everything else is mine. The house you walk through, the cars you drive, the accounts you once hid, mine. You forfeited them the moment you betrayed me. And tonight, before your children, before my children, before our friends, I reclaim what you thought you could take. Gasps rippled again. A few of the braver guests even clapped, their hands striking the air in a strange mix of disbelief and approval. Others sat stiff, torn between shock and admiration. But the room was no longer Gerald's. It was mine. Gerald's face collapsed into ruin. His skin sagged pale, his eyes wide and desperate, his lips trembling as though forming pleas that never reached his tongue. He had orchestrated this evening to be my humiliation, but instead it had become his trial. Every second stretched longer, tightening the rope around his arrogance, pulling it taut until it strangled him. Linda's hand slipped from his arm. She looked at him now not as a lover, not as a partner in conquest, but as a man who had failed her too. Her gaze lingered on the documents, the signatures, the stamps, the undeniable weight of legality. She pulled her arm back as though afraid his downfall might stain her by proximity. And still I stood, calm, unshaken, my voice echoing in the silence. Today isn't the day you humiliated me, Gerald. It's the day you freed me. Those words rang inside me like bells. They weren't for him. They were for me, for my daughters, for every guest who watched a woman scorned rise higher than the man who tried to destroy her. They were the truth of my liberation, the declaration that my worth was never his to define, never his to diminish. The room erupted, not with applause alone, but with the undeniable electricity of justice delivered. Some gasped, some murmured, some clapped louder. My daughters rose from their seats, their hands reaching for mine, their eyes blazing with a pride that cut through the wreckage of their father's betrayal. Gerald sat crumpled, the box before him, the papers spread like shards of a mirror reflecting his ruin. His glass of wine stood untouched, its surface trembling from the faint shake of the table beneath his weak hands. He had nothing left to say, no words strong enough to pierce the truth I had laid bare. And I, standing tall, my dignity intact, my resolve unshaken, looked down at the man who had once vowed to cherish me. For 50 years I had given him love, loyalty, and life itself. Tonight I gave him something far greater, justice. Gerald stood frozen, the box shaking in his hands. Linda pulled his arm, but he could barely move, humiliated in front of everyone. For the first time in decades, I felt free. Free of lies, free of betrayal, free of him. The room erupted into applause, not for him, but for me. My 75th birthday became not the day my life ended, but the day I reclaimed it. And as I looked at my daughter's tearful smiles, I knew justice had finally been served. The silence that had hung so heavy throughout the evening broke like glass underfoot, replaced by the sound of palms meeting in unison, the sound of voices murmuring in approval, the sound of truth reverberating against the walls of the home that had too long sheltered his lies. The applause was not raucous, not mocking, but steady and resolute. An ovation for survival, for dignity, for the refusal to be broken. I stood in the center of it, no longer a shadow in my own life, but the axis around which the moment turned. Gerald trembled visibly. His hands, once steady in boardrooms and social gatherings, now betrayed him, the papers fluttering as though they themselves recoiled from his touch. His face, drained of color, seemed carved from wax, expression melting into ruin. For decades, he had rehearsed the role of provider, protector, patriarch. Tonight, that role had been stripped away in front of his children, his mistress, his peers. He was not a husband, not a father, not even a man of stature. He was a hollow figure clutching the evidence of his own downfall. Linda tugged at his arm, her nails biting into his sleeve, her eyes darting toward the door, as though she could drag him out of the judgment pressing down upon them. But Gerald remained rooted, unable to flee, trapped by shame heavier than chains. She had entered this house in triumph, certain of her place, confident in her hold on him. Now she was no victor, but an accomplice, bound to his disgrace. The pearls at her throat gleamed mockingly, no longer symbols of status, but reminders of stolen wealth, tainted gifts bought with years of deception. I breathed deeply, and for the first time in years, the air filled my lungs without weight. Freedom does not always arrive in grand gestures. It arrives in the absence of fear, in the silence after confession, in the strength to stand tall while the ground shifts beneath you. Tonight, freedom arrived wrapped in applause, in the proud eyes of my daughters, in the knowledge that I had taken back what was mine. Jennifer's face glowed with pride even through her tears. She looked at me not just as her mother, but as her example, as proof that strength could bloom even in betrayal's shadow. Teresa's trembling hands reached for mine, her grip both fragile and fierce, as though holding me steady while also drawing strength from me. Their smiles, cracked and wet with grief, carried something brighter, relief. Relief that the truth had not destroyed me, but delivered me. Relief that they had not lost me to humiliation, but regained me in triumph. The guests rose to their feet, some still clapping, some simply watching with expressions that mingled awe and disbelief. Their whispers carried no pity now, only respect. Words like courage, strength, justice floated across the room, each one a balm to wounds long hidden. The humiliation Gerald had planned had boomeranged back, branding him as a coward and leaving me crowned with resilience. I stood taller, shoulders squared, chin high, the years falling from me like scales. I was 75, but I felt unshackled, reborn. The weight of silence I had carried for decades, the knowledge of his absences, the gnawing suspicion of lies, the quiet acceptance of disappointment, lifted in an instant. The chains of loyalty to a man unworthy of it dissolved, leaving me not bitter but free. Gerald's lips moved soundlessly, a man searching for excuses, explanations, words that might mend what was already shattered. None came. There was no apology strong enough, no plea persuasive enough, no lie clever enough to mask what everyone had now seen with their own eyes. His silence was his confession, his stillness his surrender. And I needed no further words. My statement had been made, my judgment delivered. The applause was not for vengeance, but for liberation. It was not that I had destroyed him. It was that I had refused to be destroyed by him. That distinction mattered. I had not fought for his downfall. I had fought for my dignity, my freedom, my truth. And I had won. As I looked at my daughter's tearful smiles, pride swelled within me. They would remember this night not as the evening their father betrayed them in public, but as the night their mother stood unbroken. They would carry the lesson that strength does not mean silence, that dignity does not mean submission, that justice is not always delivered by others, but can be seized with one's own hands. My 75th birthday was not marked by candles or cake, not by gifts wrapped in ribbons or songs sung in harmony. It was marked by the sound of applause, by the sight of my daughter's love, by the fall of a man who believed he could control the story of my life. Tonight, I reclaimed that story. Tonight, I reclaimed myself. Justice had not come from courts or lawyers alone. It had come from courage. And as the night drew on, as Gerald's shame deepened, as Linda's grip faltered, I felt the quiet truth settle in my heart. I was free.